Good morning. I think we're going to I know we're going to get started. I'm hoping that the sound we had major sound issues last week with Ruby, and I think we got it set. So we're going to see. I asked my mom to watch and call me if the sound was messed up. So we'll see. So this Sunday, this week, we begin 2 weeks of talking about the refugee crisis. And I think probably many of you know, but maybe not all, Matt Sampson is going to be with us today. Matt is an associate professor of anthropology and chair of the Latin American Studies program. And he's going to talk about the refugee crisis on the US-Mexico border in a bit. Matt is a regular at the Jubilee class and Presbyterian pastor. So we are glad you are here, Matt. Thank you. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, we ask that you open our hearts and our minds to hear what you would have us hear today. We pray for all those that are displaced from their homes, that don't know where they're going to put their head. We pray that countries and agencies can work together to help people find a place that they want to call home and to be welcome. In your name we pray. Amen. So the first question I have for you is, what is the difference between a refugee and a migrant?
Migrant, periodic.
Migrant is what?
Periodic.
Periodically, okay. What else?
I think a refugee is fleeing. They're running from.
Refugee is fleeing from?
Heading to a place where they feel safe. They're fleeing where they don't feel safe.
So we're refugees.
So they're fleeing from where they're not safe to a place where they can be safe. What else?
There's so much danger from where they come from.
They can't go through that again, Susan?
There's so much danger from where they're coming from that they cannot go home again.
Thank you. What else? Ron?
I think migrants in general are looking to go back to their country at some point.
So migrants are looking to go back? Thank you. Well, I asked Matt to help get us a correct definition of the difference between a refugee and migrant. So Matt?
Basically,
Do you
don't
microphone
have access to that document you sent.
Do you need it?
No.
Okay. Oh, yeah, everybody, I don't know if they read it, but they should have.
All right, so you had a document that you had access to that I guess is the study guide for this. But regardless, that's not the important piece here. And I think you all hit on some of the important distinctions. And when I first got to think about this a few years ago, I had the word immigrant in my mind. But I think these days, migrant is probably the word that's used the most. And then the question of refugees in relation to that comes up. But pretty much, I think you talk about safety, you talk about not being able to go home. Those end up being the major criteria for a refugee. They've suffered some kind of displacement, and usually we can think of a few categories that force people into being displaced. Conflict. Certainly a lot of us of a certain age remember the famines in Africa in the 70s, for example. Famines could be human caused because of different kinds of conflict, but natural disasters or another kind of condition that creates refugees and various kinds of persecution. That also becomes important when you think about the question of applying for asylum. You cannot get asylum typically in the United States. A little bit different category still if you don't belong to a particular group that is persecuted in some way. Okay. And then it gets more complex from there because the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which was founded in 1950, and then the Refugee Convention that came into force in 1951, and over 100, maybe 120, it could even be higher than that, state entities have signed that Refugee Convention, then determine how nation states deal with refugees. So we have this whole body of international law that comes into being essentially after World War II, when we're dealing with a lot of refugees and displaced people. So these definitions get really important, both from a standpoint of international law, but also particular law in particular countries. And so what I want to argue is that you got actually three categories, migrants, you got refugees, and you have asylum seekers. That makes sense kind of to start with. So refugees are, as you point out, people who don't feel safe, who can't go home. And sometimes these days we talk about forced migration. So a lot of refugees would be in situations related to those categories that create refugees I mentioned before, but think of those as push factors that lead people to leave their home country usually. Okay. Then it gets more complicated because there are a lot of internally displaced people also within certain countries. And depending on how you look at them, the formal UN definition seems to be that there are about 20 million refugees in the world, maybe 20 and a half these days. So these are people that would actually be in a refugee camp or something like that. But other organizations, I pulled up Doctors Without Borders a little while ago, talk about as many as 80 million refugees in the world these days. And those would include internally displaced people and asylum seekers, which actually end up being a smaller category still. But probably on the southern border, what we're dealing with mostly are asylum seekers in the United States. People who in some way or another, perhaps because they've been forced to leave or feel like they're forced to leave, then want to come to the United States to better their life chances. And they may well be fleeing persecution. These days, we even talk about climate change as a push factor in terms of natural disasters. 2 hurricanes in Central America since COVID started. Okay, so these are the different kind of categories that we want to keep in mind. So when you hear the term migrants, it's much more all-encompassing. And well, we haven't watched the video yet. I was going to make a comment about that.
I just have a question. So I'm so confused on the difference between asylum seekers and a refugee.
The refugee convention, I'm stepping out on a limb here because this is not actually what I do my research on, although I get pulled into it all the time. A refugee is a person who cannot go home. And what the video is going to explain, because I did watch it, is what the formal refugee process is through the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. And it's actually a very small percentage of that 20 million that may actually become refugees who are resettled. Because when you're a refugee, you're kind of in an in-between status. You've left one place, you can't go home. So what's going to happen to you? An asylum seeker could be a refugee, and they do apply for asylum, but you don't have to have the formal UN designation as a refugee to apply for asylum. If you are a member of an LGBT group or something like that, and you feel like because you're a trans person, you belong to a group of people who is systematically in some way persecuted, you might apply for asylum, for example. Or gang violence in Central America ends up being a lot of people feel like it's untenable. There was a question in the back. So you might leave and then try to apply for asylum simply. But in those cases, you get to choose the country you go to. And when we talk about Latin America, although people from all over the world are actually being deported on the United States southern border right now, a lot of people are coming from Africa, Asia, Caribbean, even going to Central America and trying to come to the United States as well. That help a little bit?
Thank you. My stereotype.
For the people.
My impression is that most asylum, this is probably an antiquated definition, that asylum seekers are typically fleeing political oppression, official political oppression in their various countries and places of their origin. Is that not accurate?
No, I think it's much more multifaceted than that. I think typically that is what we often would have thought about, in that is that people are being politically persecuted. And so I have no problem with that at all, but I would just argue that it's much more multifaceted. That makes sense.
Thanks, Matt. And we'll hear back from Matt in a little bit. Our scripture today to keep in mind as we explore this topic is from 1 Corinthians 12. But as it is, there are many parts, but one body. So the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you, or in turn, the head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. Instead, the parts of the body that think they are the weakest are the most necessary. The parts of the body that we think are less honorable are the ones that we honor the most. The private parts of our body that aren't presentable are the ones that are given the most dignity. The parts of our body that are presentable don't need this, but God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts with less honor, so there won't be division in the body, and so the parts might have mutual concern for each other. If one part suffer, all parts suffer with it. If one part gets the glory, all the parts celebrate with it. Our videos, Matt already has told us, is going to walk us through the refugee screening process, and we're going to hear about the effects of prolonged displacement.
In the aftermath of World War II, the world was witness to the greatest refugee crisis of the 20th century. The newly formed United Nations responded by establishing the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, and introduced foundational international refugee policies that continued to be adapted over the next 40 years as subsequent refugee crises arose. These policies have been ratified by 146 countries, including the United States. Under these policies, it is made clear what defines a refugee. Unlike a migrant, refugees do not choose to leave their homes. They are fleeing persecution and should be granted asylum, as denial of asylum would have potentially deadly consequences.
There is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says in Article 14 that every person has the right to seek asylum, to seek protection in another country if they're persecuted or fleeing from war.
The policies also lay out the rights of a refugee, rights that a given host country are obligated to protect. In short, these policies maintain that once an asylum seeker has entered your country, they are to be treated the same as any other legal resident. Countries vary in their level of adherence to these policies. For instance, the country of Jordan have eased their employment laws and now allow their large refugee population to work in food and agricultural trades. Whereas Australia, until recently, were placing many asylum seekers in detention camps indefinitely. Australia is not alone in this attitude towards seekers of asylum. A majority of developed nations with robust economies have maintained or enhanced internal policies that discourage or directly prevent those seeking asylum from crossing their borders, placing the burden of the current crisis largely on smaller developing nations with inadequate infrastructure or resources.
Less than 1% of the refugee population is able to integrate into the country to which they've fled, because in 2016, the last year that we have statistics for, 84% of the world's refugee population of over 22 million, 84% of those people were in developing countries.
In just the last few years, the tiny country of Jordan has taken on over 700,000 refugees, the equivalent of 11% of their country's total population. To match that proportion, the U.S. would have to host over 35 million refugees. To mirror Lebanon, the U.S. would have to host over 100 million. With it unsafe to return to their home country and integration into their host country virtually impossible, the only other viable solution is resettling refugees in a third country. The United States has long been considered a leader in refugee resettlement. Since its Refugee Act was passed in 1980, an average of 80,000 refugees have been resettled in the United States each year, the equivalent of 0.02% of the current U.S. population. And yet, in this unprecedented time of human need, the U.S. has chosen to reduce the number of refugees being taken in to their lowest levels in over a decade.
Because of our fear of these people that we don't know, fear of the other, the West is working very hard at putting up walls, mobilizing their military to stop, to prevent the most desperate people on the planet from finding refuge.
National security is the prominent concern driving the scrutiny of the resettlement of refugees in the U.S., the prevailing question being the thoroughness of the resettlement screening process. However, very few are familiar with what the actual screening process is. In order for someone to even be considered for resettlement, they must first be granted refugee status by the UNHCR. The UN collects identifying documents and performs an initial assessment and may require iris scans. Then the refugee has to wait. Typically, a year after this, the refugee is then interviewed by the UN to reconfirm their refugee status and establish if there is a need for resettlement. Only those who pass the background check and are deemed by the UNHCR to be the most vulnerable are chosen to move forward with the resettlement screening process. These select few account for less than 1% of the global refugee population, or roughly 1 out of every 191 refugees. This part of the process typically takes several years, and if anything in your personal status changes during that time, the entire process starts over.
One is I was interviewed in the UNHCR settlement office. I got married. Then my case has to be return to the UNHCR again, restart again. Then once I got to the embassy, I got one child. Then I have to restart again. Because anytime you add a family member, the case goes back where it started.
The UNHCR then submits their list of recommended candidates to the 36 countries that have resettlement programs. These countries then choose which individuals they believe would be a good fit. Refugees themselves have little to no say as to which country they are to be resettled in. Once the United States selects a refugee for possible resettlement, they are then put through the U.S. screening process, which is the most rigorous screening for any individual looking to enter the country. Additional identifying documents and information are compiled into a file for the applicant's security checks and biometric screenings. The candidate is then screened by the National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department. The Department of Homeland Security also performs an enhanced review of all the refugees from Syria. And if at any time new information is provided, the entire process is repeated.
I have to be very cautious about not asking too many questions in a row because it reminds them of all the interviews that they'd had before that were frightening and that were, powerful, because if they blew it, they couldn't come.
Fingerprints are then taken and screened against databases of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Department of Defense. If at any time security concerns arise, the process is halted and the candidate is rejected. Otherwise, the process continues. The next step is a medical screening where candidates can also be rejected for a variety of medical reasons.
And after you have done the medical process, then there is a lot of background checks that you never know what's happening. The background check cleared, medical can expire, and you have to restart again. So this two entity, puts people to wait 10 years, 15 years.
If the medical screening is passed, the refugee begins resettlement preparations, including cultural orientation and determining what would be the best resettlement location for them. Throughout this entire process, the applicants are continually rescreened against databases to ensure that new relevant information has not come to light. If at any time there is any doubt that an applicant poses a security risk, they will not be admitted. Those who make it through the entire process are then granted approval to finally enter and resettle in the United States. They are then required to apply for their green card within a year, which triggers yet another set of security procedures with the U.S. government.
Refugees come here having gone through a 1.5 to 2 years at minimum of screening overseas, being checked by at least 8 different federal agencies. They're vetted more than any other class of traveler or visitor to the United States.
In one appointment, they give you 5 months and again another 5 months, even a year. We stay with the interview for around 4 years. After that, they transfer our document to U.S. Embassy. U.S. Embassy also has its own interview and screening. So many screening. We go ahead for a long 2 or 3 years also in embassy. After that, we pass that screening system and come here. It is a long.
What surprised you in that video?
How long it takes.
How long it takes?
redundancy.
The redundancy,
Over and over and
over and over and over. What else?
The persistence of those refugees.
The persistence of refugees? Yeah. What else?
I actually was surprised at the bias that was presented, whether it's the graphic of the massive stack of papers that's taller than even and the thought, which, that's supposed to make you feel terrible. It didn't. It feel terrible.
Yeah.
And it probably is a lot of paperwork. But I don't imagine the images we saw, the animated images, I think, are there to impact us, and it did serve that way, but it was presented in a way, or the fact that one of the steps is being fingerprinted. Well, there's a lot of jobs that American citizens are required to be fingerprinted. It's not just something that happens to a refugee, but it was presented as part of the many steps that we have to go through. But that's not just a refugee step. So I felt like I was trying to watch it with a critical eye. And so that surprised me, but the biases that were in that.
Okay, thank you.
I was surprised by the selection process, which is approved by the UN agency, where a number of countries that are registered as settlement locations have the opportunity to select and delete
Yeah.
a number of people.
So the selection of individuals by countries, kind of like a Lewis lottery.
It made me wonder if, as citizens, if we were to go through this process, would we have or would we maintain our citizenship even though we are citizens? We might not. We might feel like we're out
You have to put the in one.
The one thing that I thought that really stood out in the video is, and I wrote it down so I can see it, that they said less than 1% of those seeking asylum are deemed acceptable to move forward in the refugee process. Less than 1%. That is a bit of a, for me, it was a shocking number. I don't want to spend too much long. I want to give Matt some time to talk because he's got some, I think, good insights for you. But the series is called Dialogue. So it's talking about difficult and sometimes hard subjects. How can we, what are ways we can, let me stop in. So there are lots of different views about refugees and asylum seekers in the United States at this point. How can we find common ground to move forward in this discussion when people have all different types of views?
I think education is key.
Education?
Because that long article that you set out was very informative, and I had no idea about a lot of the information contained in it. And I think the vast majority of Americans think about the borders are open, people are flowing across, there's no people,
There's no requirements, and just the extent of the requirements that people have to go through, I think would surprise a lot of rank and file Americans who think people are just flowing in without having to go through any kind of screening or test or anything like that. And so education, I think, is.
What else? Thank you, Susan. Has anybody ever known somebody that has come through the immigration process? It is shocking. After I'd gone to college, we had a pastor at our home church from Sri Lanka, was Christian and had fled. And, he had been in the United States for years, was working on his citizenship. And I remember at the very end hearing that, after everything had been approved, they made him before they would let him become, get the final step, he had to physically leave the country. Then come back in. Then they would say, okay, you can become a U.S. citizen. So he literally had to fly like to Canada from Pittsburgh, got off the plane, went through immigration, then immediately left and came back to the United States. It just seems somewhat crazy.
A good example, though, that the world has at their fingertips is the World Council of Churches. And as an organization of worldliness, they can provide an avenue with other churches. We had that experience in Louisville, Kentucky. Political problems in Romania, and a family left. And it was a very positive outcome. Now, I'm not going into detail about the little mountains they had to climb that you saw here, but if churches were involved at a much higher level, but it's difficult to even get churches to agree that we have a problem and we need to solve that problem. And then you have to look at the other side of the equation, is that once they arrive here, what are they going to do? How are they going to contribute? What's going to happen to the food supply in the United States? We're talking only right now geopolitically within the U.S. There are so many issues and so much divisiveness amongst us, even in this church, I'm sure, and we've only been here 4 weeks, but been in other churches and sessions and knowing that we have to listen to what God tells us. But the World Council of Churches is a very prominent avenue here.
Thank you. That's all.
Following up on that, this congregation, I can recall 2 times we've sponsored refugees. One was a Vietnamese family, maybe in the 80s, you probably remember. And then there was a Russian family that Rosemary and Charlie became very close to. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, and I understand it's not, you still have to, a church can't just say we're going to sponsor somebody. You have to go through all that U.S. bureaucracy and everything. So I think it's not as easy as it was then or as possible, but I just want to say we had done it.
All right, Matt, I'm going to go ahead and ask you a big stab at helping me understand this crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border.
I don't normally do it this way, but I wasn't totally clear what kind of discussion this was supposed to be. When I read the materials, what was the title? On dialogue about refugee issues. I didn't exactly have a rug pulled out from under my feet, but a lot of times in Jubilee class, I feel like I'm preaching or speaking to a choir. And I've got some very definite opinions and some responses to a couple of things that have been said here. But maybe I should ask what kind of, in the effort to listen, what kind of questions you have for just a couple of minutes. And then I'll see if I can integrate some of my remarks into, I think I heard a couple of them as well as a couple of comments, but I'll integrate my remarks into maybe some of your questions. If you have any specific ones. If not, I'll take a stab at what I can give you in terms of a panorama that is frankly not a pretty one and is very difficult precisely because we're so divided on these issues in terms of our politics.
Any questions? Set up, Matt? I think panorama, very informative of what's going on.
Okay. Well, let me start, and I think this is, I think about asylum and I think about borders when I think of these issues, because I'm approaching these issues from having worked in Latin America, gone to seminary in Austin, Texas in the 80s, when the wars were going on in Central America, the aftermath of which is still very, very much with us. And the denomination itself had taken some very clear stances on some of those situations, and the sanctuary movement was in full force. The sanctuary movement was a movement, as opposed to going through the system to house refugees, and we have a new sanctuary movement. It doesn't seem to have quite the footing these days. Maybe it doesn't seem new enough anymore and just doesn't get as much attention. But a lot of congregations simply said if people had shown up and they thought that those folk were under threat and the government was not going to give them asylum, we were going to put them up and often in the walls of the church. Okay, very, very different from going through this multi-year process in which your odds aren't very good. You might still get stuck in a so-called less developed country while you're waiting. And basically, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So that longer document, sounds like a couple of you may have read that, talks about this refugee camp in Kenya that has 250,000 people in it. And a third of the people in that camp were born there. So even if you think that the United Nations system is a good system, one that at least tries to help people that are in need, it's inadequate. And in our own political system, the prior administration, if I'm not mistaken, I always talk and I find out I got the details wrong, so go check anything I say. But they had basically said, he started out saying we're not going to let people from a certain set of countries that have predominantly Muslim populations come here. Before he was out of office, he had limited the number of refugees that the United States would take in on a yearly basis to next to nothing. Biden said he was going to change it, and he didn't jump on it his first 2 months in office. And by May, he had a problem because he hadn't owned up to his own campaign promise. Do you remember this? I'm not trying to jump ahead, but this is the situation. This is the kind of divisiveness we're dealing with. And we have a long, and this is where I lose the details. We have a long history, not as long as some people think, because you get I get the dates wrong, but you begin to get certain kind of immigration restrictions in the late 1800s. The borders are still moderately open until about the 1920s. I can't remember which came first. The Chinese Exclusion Act is usually the first law that you'll hear about that we kind of put in place to keep a particular group of people out. Okay, so you're going back to the very late 1800s. In the 1920s, we'll begin to these more various kinds of laws that restrict immigration. And we had some because you had to come through Ellis Island. We know that you couldn't just walk in every case, especially if you're coming on a boat from across the pond, as they say. But you can still see pictures of towns on the US-Mexico border that literally looked about like this. If you see an aerial view, Mexico's on one side, well, that's north, so the United States on this side. Mexico's here. And, if you wanted to go have a drink on that side, you just basically could walk across. See those same towns now, because we do have borders, there's a fence. A lot of times there's a wall. Some of the towns have the same name, Nogales. Okay, they call it the Los Dos Nogales, the two Nogales, because you have one on both sides of the border. Now you'll have a wall and you might see cars parked on both sides, people going about their business in their respective countries, right? So we have to understand that immigration policy, as we understand it, in certain regards, again, I don't want to overstate the case, is only about roughly half of our history has it even been in place the way we think of it. And globally, we continue to have to take into account these masses of refugees or displaced people. And if I use the term 80 million a while ago, the numbers I was using only 3 or 4 years ago said there were like 65 million refugees in the world. Again, that includes internally displaced in some places, lots of places. Okay. The number of migrants globally at the same time was about 245 million people. So a migrant is anybody who can leave and potentially wants to or can return home. But part of this is to say that people are on the move. People who are forced and they become refugees or for other reasons seek asylum, even if they don't have the designation refugee. Many people politically persecuted, okay? But there are lots of other people who are moving for other reasons, sometimes simply to better their lives. We even know people from the United States who've been joking about going to Canada to better their lives over the last 4 years. Okay, that would be migration in that sense. That wouldn't even necessarily be because of persecution, and it wouldn't be because you were in economic straits. Exactly. That's a great example. We do it all the time. And Article 13, this video referred to Article 14 of the Declaration of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But Article 13 says this, which I use sometimes in a class that I teach. 1, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. So you have the freedom to move within your country's borders. 2, everyone has the right to leave any country, language is gender, including his own, and to return to his country. So, not quite sure how you want to interpret that. So, certainly, if you leave, you should be able to return to the place you left from. But what about this idea that you can leave? That seems to me, at least on some level, to indicate that free movement of peoples is codified in the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
One of the things that I hear a lot is
we've got to have limits on how many people we come in. And then when I hear this statistic, I'm just blown away. We can't allow those people, and that they're proud of what was done about saying this is all we can't take care of what's already here in our own country. Why should we accept these others?
Okay.
But,
Thank
anyway,
you for that, because I'm trying to set up some kind of a scenario, but I think the historical context is really important. But also the larger, we don't just have dialogue amongst ourselves. We're dialoguing with all kinds of systems that we live under. And educating ourselves is truly important, but it's complex. And the idea that you're going to put an immigration policy in place in 2021 and it's going to look the same when I get to the end of my life, which I hope is at least a couple of decades more, it's just nonsense. All of our laws change all the time. So we might, first of all, think about how you can put in place some kind of a system that's flexible, or at least potentially can be revised without the kind of problems we have revising the system that we have now. So Linda, your question, you can't put a value on it. I want to say a $64,000 question, but it's bigger than that because you're talking about human lives. So to backtrack a little bit, when the denomination was involved in Central America in the 80s, there was lots of migration. We've had migration from Cuba since Cuba's revolution. But we have had different standards for who we're going to let in. For a long time, Cubans could get in just by showing up. Why? Because they're fleeing communism. In those days, now, you know, I have to confess my own sins. I protested in favor of Daniel Ortega in the 80s. I stood out in front of the embassy in Managua one day in the 80s when I was in seminary, protesting U.S. policy, which I do think was bad in Nicaragua in those days. I don't particularly like the guy anymore, as an understatement. Okay? All right. But we would take people from Nicaragua in those days, at least a few of them. Why? Because the Sandinistas were a socialist or a communist government, and they were okay. Salvadorans wanted to come in. We put $5 billion in El Salvador in the 1980s. Salvadorans want to come in, and I'm really not talking in circles. I hope you're following where I'm going. When Salvadorans want to come in, they were told they were economic refugees, and they wanted to come because we were supporting their dictatorship. And the numbers of people from El Salvador who give were a lot fewer than people in Nicaragua. I don't have all these statistics at hand, but because our immigration policy is politicized, it doesn't focus on the individuals. You get a lot of uneven-handedness in this. But let's just suppose that we want to take Central America as it is, as a country that is very poor in relation to the United States standards. Perhaps a lot of that poverty, some of us who study the region would argue, is at least partially related to U.S. policy over the 20th century, including occupation of these territories, supporting dictatorships in multinational corporations like banana companies when the governments wanted to do land reformation. Okay. Do we have any responsibility? That's one way to look at it. The other issue is simply to take it at face value. People are poor, they want to better their lives and move. Should they be allowed to do that? Is it simply a zero-sum game of we don't have the resources? Is it true that they don't contribute anything to the economy or pay Social Security taxes? Do you look at who's doing yard work and put roofs on houses in Mecklenburg County? It doesn't answer the question, but it suggests, I think, that we need to be asking different kinds of questions. And then related to the comment about the World Council of Churches, what kind of public theology, this is a term I get from Latin American Christians as much as I do from the United States because I've been hanging around that neighborhood long enough, that what kind of public theology is the church going to offer in these kinds of debates? Raising the kinds of questions about who we are as a people. When poor people come knocking on our door, poor people who are willing to do work, there's no doubt that in some cases, people without insurance, many cases perhaps, get in the hospital and somebody has to foot the bill. I'm not going to ignore that but we're an incredibly wealthy country. And it is simply not true that these folks are not contributing anything when they come here. Some people have done different kinds of economic analysis. And I do have a colleague at Davidson that works on this that say that they put in more even economically than they take out. So first of all, we need to get our story straight. That's the education piece. But for me, because of where I grew up and where I come from, we also need to think about some people think it's opposed to the humanistic aspect of what our theology is. Because the question of what we're proclaiming and how we represent ourselves, I think, is the crucial question theologically. So that then is a point of contention and debate. Yeah.
A lot of things are running through my head, and one of the things that was mentioned in the video, they used the word host in talking about the countries. And I'm thinking about Japan is hosting the Olympics, and because of the pandemic, they said spectators aren't coming. But in any other normal year of an Olympic, when you host the Olympics, you invite and welcome as many people to come and participate and partake. And I realize that's just a window. You're not inviting people to come and live, but you want them to come and spend money on souvenirs and spend money on, it's an economic boom if you do that. It provides jobs for people when they prepare for the Olympics. So I was thinking in terms of transferring that concept of hospitality and hosting to the concept of immigration, the concept of refugees, and how welcoming are we? And Matt, this is what I don't know. Is there a country that does it better or gets it close to what we want it to look like? What would be a model for how, does it exist? And the last thing I want to say is President Jefferson always believed that it's presumptuous for people to make rules and laws that will exist long after they ever exist. And so that the government should renew itself every couple of generations. And so laws that were made in the 50s, the people that made those laws most likely are not existing anymore. And so, yeah, we do need to relook and re-examine, because in the 50s, people didn't imagine what they would see today.
All that's very helpful. So you've given us at least one of the theological currents that I think we need actually, both in our public theology, but in our day-to-day theology in spaces like this.
You got about 5 minutes.
You know, hospitality is an important step. And yet, how do we talk about hospitality in relation to what is portrayed as a bunch of people at the border who are overrunning the borders? This gets back to the Linda's portrait. And they're going to come in and they're going to take something from you. It's really an insidious discourse when you get right down to it. And were you going to say something, Joe?
Okay.
So the idea of hospitality is one framework that I think would be useful to think about that.
One of the one of the biggest groups in Florida not wanting Cubans to come into the United States are previous Cuban immigrants. They want to close the door behind them. There's enough Cubans there, so they fight vigorously to keep that from happening.
Okay, so you have these situations where people who benefited don't want other people to come. Well, okay, so let me respond to one other question quickly, and then I'll try to close with something that's at least fun, if not helpful. But yeah, who's doing this are the countries that are bordering the places where there's the most displacement. Some of them were mentioned in the film. Turkey, I mentioned this refugee camp in Kenya. Jordan ends up pretty high on some of these lists, okay? So sometimes out of necessity, people are responding. Seems like we have a lot of necessity on our southern border. But we also have big military and big policing. And part of what we have done is said, okay, Mexico, help us a little bit on the northern border. When you don't help us on the northern border, since Mexicans actually in recent years have become almost a net zero migration force in the United States. Most of the migrants from Latin America are coming from Central America these days. So what we do is we go into Mexico and we say, why don't you militarize your southern border so you can keep all these Central Americans from coming up here? And you've seen these pictures of these migrant caravans. Might remember a couple of months ago, it was in May, when a bunch of Hondurans left Honduras. They went to Guatemala. They had to turn around and go back. So what we do, rather than hospitality, what we do is we militarize the borders. And what we do, here's a good theological point for you. They talked about national security in this. I hate to tell you, the nation state's not going away, even if I might be for more open borders. We're still going to have countries. But what is national security in the first place? You know, sometimes I've run from my Presbyterian roots, but we talk about the sovereignty of God. We talk about sin. We talk about idolatry because God's supposed to be sovereign. But national security is not idolatrous force in the United States. It's not that we should not be safe. It's not that people should not be safe in their borders, but everybody should be safe. And we live in a global community in some way or another, because we're all human beings. And I'm an anthropologist, so I may as well throw a little anthropology in. You know, talk about all these migrants in the world. Where does the species come from? At least according to what most of us have gotten. Africa. We all migrated out of Africa. We populated the entire world. We're a migratory species. People move.
The U.S. is a prime example of that. What happened?
None of us are in this room probably are native to the Americas. So, I mean, I always find that fascinating when you're talking with people about, well, just because your family has been here for a couple hundred years, you are still an immigrant at some point or another. Two things I just wanted to say. One is the UN system, as you were talking about, it seems like it started back post-World War II, but has it been re-examined at all in that time period to be more flexible, to be more appropriate for the current crisis? And my last question is, I think the other stumbling block for a lot of Americans is, what do you do about the people already here that didn't come legally? And that seems to also be a prime point of contention between accepting new immigrants in, because there's a lot of immigrants that are here that haven't gone through any kind of legal process. So those are just two, probably needs to wait till next week, but I pose them.
Let me take, what was the first question? Okay, the UN. I think all of these structures are being examined constantly, but they don't change quickly. Laws don't change quickly. And I read you part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. You heard part of it there. We know having these standards in place is very different from the way in which practically these things work. And some people argue that a rights framework might not even be the best framework sometimes. That because our rights are based on something that adheres to you and me because of the fact that I'm human. What, do groups have rights? That's where I work in Latin America. What about cultural rights for indigenous folk? Gets really complex real fast. People that are here, you've got to put a system in place. That's what DACA is all about. Even under Reagan, we gave so-called amnesty. We naturalized. I don't like the word amnesty because it just gets politicized, and I don't want to foment that. I don't care what you call it, to millions of people. But they thought, okay, it's over and done with. But it's not. And some of the people coming from Latin America are the fruit of gangs that were started in LA that we sent back to El Salvador. They had been displaced in the first place. They go back to a country they don't know is their own. Now, this is one portrait. There are other portraits you can paint. And yet we reap the benefits of that. Or the pain. So that's a short answer to that question. Another minute? Or
another minute? Will you close us in prayer, Matt?
Yeah. So I've been pulled back into the pulpit lately a couple of times, and for supply preaching. And every now and then I don't just go reach in what we used to call the barrel and pull out a sermon, but I actually try to write something new. So I've been forced to deal with prophets like Ezekiel and Amos a couple of times. And yeah, it's interesting because you were talking about our situation and the fact that we're all immigrants. But we're all dealing with a certain kind of displacement or exile, I think. Massive public health crisis that's global in scope. Systemic racism. We often talk about that in black and white terms, and we had an event here last week there. But what about displacement of indigenous peoples and Africans? Okay, so I'm arguing that in a sense that these situations force us to confront our own moments of exile and our displacement. And one of the prophets, Ezekiel, I don't know if you even know much about Ezekiel. I think I've avoided Ezekiel most of my life. You might remember something about a wheel within a wheel, but what do you remember about Ezekiel? More than anything. See, most of us don't even know. The call, huh? He was exiled in the bones. Remember the valley of dry bones? Okay. But when he's called, even the voice that comes to him doesn't think that the people are going to listen to him. Several times in that passage it says, go preach, thus saith the Lord God. They're probably not going to listen to you because they're rebellious people. Then you got to go through a bunch of other stuff. Now you skip over it just like everybody else, and you get in this valley of dry bones. And then what you end up with in our context, maybe we sung these songs at church camp or something like that, but it's a spiritual called Them Bones that maybe you've actually seen or heard. Interestingly, the music was written by James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. Maybe his brother participated in it according to Wikipedia, but I won't go there either. But so there's an interesting context. But thinking of 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 2.
12.
First or second?
First.
First, right. You know, in the body, what about them bones? You know, and maybe what we need to think about then is possibility of restoration and hospitality in the context of exile, our own exile from the people that we are called to be. So them bones, you might remember, you know, it helps us because the bones can't rise again until they're all connected. The toe bone to the foot bone, to the heel bone, to the leg bone, to the knee bone, to the thigh bone, to the hip bone, to the back bone, to the shoulder bone, to the neck bone, to the head bone. Then you have an articulated skeleton that can walk. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.